welcome. Today we're going to be talking about habits of success and practices of failure. If everything looks good, give me a thumbs up. You can hear and see okay. There's the little interaction. Okay, so yes, you've all found the interaction thing. I encourage you, if there's something that you find interesting, disagree with, whatever, hit that button. It's a great way to give feedback as we go. Another thing that's interesting is I've just updated my system here, and before it was really hard for me to see if somebody was on video. Somebody asked me last week if I liked having participants on video. I've now got it set up to where if you're on video, I actually see you, and in the past you were like sorted down a list, I couldn't see you. So if people want to be on video so I can see reactions and stuff, that's great. If you're eating ribs or something, I totally understand that that might not be what you want to do. So anyway, it's an option now that is beneficial. In the past it didn't make a difference. So I'm going to talk about just a few random things here before we get started. We've got more people joining as people grab their lunch and get on. This one was one of the more responded to talks that we've had for a while. There's a lot more people seemed interested in this. So a couple just interesting things that I mentioned in the past there are updates on. You may have remembered I was talking about how my kids and I and nieces and nephews hooked an air tag to a balloon and sent it off, or to a bunch of balloons and sent it off to see what would happen back in June. And then there was just nothing. It was like, okay, we just threw away a $25 air tag. But just this week, we got a ping from it, and it's in this farmer's field evidently. And we haven't made our way out there to find it, but it evidently came down somewhere. I don't know if they were just doing something in the field and got close enough to it with an iPhone. So our goal for this week is to go meet these farmers and ask if we can go through their field and see if we can recover this thing. It made it about 30 miles away, so not too far. So anyway, just in case anybody was wondering what happened with that. Coming up next week, we're going to be talking about Awesomely Simple. So this is an interesting book. It is not a book about Agile. It's a book about running your business and what the author has found consistently with businesses that do well. And I read this, and what was really interesting for me is how much it aligns to what I've seen successful on Agile teams. So we're going to be doing, I think this one's a short, like 30 minutes. We're going to go through, hit the high points from the book, talk about how it relates to Agile real briefly, and then do a little quiz so we can remember it and give the winner this copy of this book. So anyway, should be fun. It's kind of one of those things that, like, if you were just reading on your own, it's like, hey, that really relates, and I thought it would be worth sharing. So this will be coming up next week. After that is a talk that I'm especially looking forward to on the 29th. This is my son Benjamin and I, and we are going to be doing a test-driven development and pair programming example. Benjamin is 13 and has been doing some programming. We'll be using a language called Racket. It's a form of Lisp. It's fairly easy to understand even if you don't do programming, because it condenses down to basically the way that we approach algebra. So it should be a lot of fun. I encourage you to come to that. We're going to be going through making a little algorithm using test-driven development and pair programming, and excited to have my son on the lunch and learn. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Then I'm working on getting set up, and I've got somebody that says they're going to do it. They're going to be talking about how he uses ChatGPT for test-driven development and some of the things he's experimented with that. So I'm really looking forward to this one because this is an interesting kind of area, and the gentleman that will be doing this has some interesting takeaways for like how it helps, how it can mislead you, and what you need to know to be able to actually take advantage of this. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Also, I want to mention, when you get these invites, I think I put this in here, but when you get these invites, you've got the option of saying yes, maybe, or no. Just to let you know, I use that to help gauge how many people are interested, even if they can't come. So if it's a topic that you're like, hey, I'd really like to come to that, but I probably won't be able to unless my meeting gets canceled, go ahead and click the maybe, because that will let me see how much their interest is and how much interest there is in it. And we'll make it to where I'll try to do those talks more frequently, do those again. If you say no, then that takes you out of the list, so I won't send you anything else about it. I do from time to time go through, and if I haven't gotten a response, I'll send another one like a few days before, just in case it got buried in the email or deleted accidentally or something like that. So by responding to this, it lets me know, hey, they got it. Even if you say, no, I'm not interested in coming, that lets me know, okay, then I don't need to send them any more information about that. So just so you know how that's working behind the scenes. Okay, so that brings us to habits of success and practices of failure. I'm going to throw a link in here in the chat. Let me stick that up here. How long is Awesomely Simple? The talk will be, it's just a 30-minute talk, so it'll be pretty short. Okay, so I just put a link in there. Bring that up. We'll be using that as we go. If somebody else can, next time when we do start to use it, copy it and throw it in there for anybody that joins just a little bit late. Habits of success and practices of failure. So a big question, a very important question, is what makes teams successful, right? There's lots of different ways to look at this. And then also the inverse of that is asking what makes some teams fail. And so what I've tried to do here is go through and sit down and really think about what are the things on teams that turn out to be successful that I see that's constantly repeated. It seems to be tied to their ability to deliver software and do it successfully. And on the other end of that, also thinking, what are the things that I've experienced on teams that they consistently do, consistently practice, that appears to be tied to the fact that they're not able to deliver. And the project either gets canceled or they just have unhappy customers or whatever. So I was trying to go through and make lists to try to say, what has my experience been? And we'll have some question stuff as we go because I'm kind of interested in seeing what everybody else thinks as well, what your experience has been. So we'll start with 7 practices that lead to failure. So first question for you is, can you name a practice that leads teams to failure? So something you've seen that seems to be very correlated with if the team does this particular practice, it often leads them to the point that they're not able to deliver software successfully for their customers. Not agreeing on the goal? Yes, that's great. Yeah, if you've got people going in different directions, it's hard for them to succeed. Working in silos, so they're not collaborating, no communication, so great. Working in silos, okay, that's a popular one coming up. Going over committing, okay, that's good. I see I see some people are responding in the chat, and that's great. I do see those. If you go to this link, then it puts it up where everybody can see it on the screen, so feel free to do that. Budget, that's another thing. If there's not a budget to succeed, budget's an interesting one because I think a lot of times when I've seen teams fail from budget, it has more to do with their prioritization than it does with the budget, but that's not always the case. Not being accountable, don't get stakeholders' feedback, always was on this way, not providing a feedback loop, not listening, silos, developers working ahead of getting requirements. There's a Dilbert who says, I'll start writing the code, you figure out what it needs to do. Not setting expectations for teams and projects, keeping plans only in your head, disengaged developers, no proper understanding of the need. That's a good point. Like if you don't know why you're doing something, always saying yes, not asking why. Oh, these are great. I should have asked you all these before I put the talk together. The hero, so I guess the programmer that's doing everything, but kind of the cowboy coder, maybe that's what we're talking about. Communication issues, no support from management, not taking responsibility, micromanaging peer, not having shared outcomes, no debate before making decisions. Okay, well, I can tell by the flood of things coming through, listening to Dilbert, the flood of things coming through, everyone here probably has some experience with practices that don't help with success. So we're going to look at some of these, and I mean, this makes it abundantly clear there's lots more. And what I want to encourage you to do is be thinking about these things, right? And not just the ones I mentioned, but the ones that you've experienced, and asking yourself, is there anything we can do as a team to steer away from these practices that lead to failure? So here's the practices that I've got that I'm thinking of. So large teams, that's one thing. Misleading definition of progress, low emphasis on delivery capability, creation of waste, customer collaboration is discouraged, and conflicting priorities. So of these, and we'll go into these in more details, but what I'd like to know is if you were to vote for one of these, just the ones I've mentioned, and everybody put some great ones up there, which one do you think most leads to failure? Like, which do you think is the biggest deal of those listed? No right answer here. I'm just curious what people think. I think it'll show us the top 5. Okay, it looks like misleading definition of progress is in the top spot. Creating waste is next, or tied with having large teams. And then not emphasizing delivery enough and avoiding domain work. But it's interesting, misleading definition of progress. So that I find that fascinating that the biggest thing that people are pointing to are when we think we're making progress, but we're not actually making progress. And that makes sense, because if we actually have good measurements of whether or not we're making progress, it might push us away from all these other things, right? If we're measuring progress well, we may be very easy to tell that we're avoiding domain work. If we're measuring progress well, it may be a lot easier to tell that we're creating waste and we need to do something different. So that kind of makes sense, because that's kind of underlying, that's your kind of your thermometer showing you how well are we doing. And if you can't see that, you can't trust your speedometer, and don't know how well you're doing, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Okay, so let's go through these, and I've expanded on them a little bit here. So large teams. Big thing I see with large teams is scaling before the project is proven viable. And that can be proven viable from the standpoint of, is this project worth doing? But also from the standpoint of, do we have any expectation that we can deliver software efficiently enough to justify the expense that it's going to require, or the investment that it's going to require? Or just scaling stuff that seemed to work for other projects, or that just somebody thinks will be a good idea, and then later finding out that we scaled the stuff we didn't need, and we didn't scale the stuff that actually mattered to scale. So starting with a large team, big practice that leads to failure. I've seen a lot of people that are very worried about not having enough people. And in my experience, the risk of not having enough people is often, like, the actual consequences of that is often a lot less painful than the consequences of scaling before you're actually ready to do it. Okay, see, network issues. Is everybody else able to give me a thumbs up if everything's looking okay for you? Okay, so I think this side network is working. I guess I could have done something a little bit different here, but hopefully that's working. Okay, great. If you do see a problem, let me know. Avoiding domain work. So lots of times getting ready to do development. We'll talk about how that, and it sounds like a really good thing, and there are reasons you want to invest in being prepared to do development, but you've got to be very, very careful, because it can be a big trap. Misleading definition of progress, so poor definition of done, or lots of focus on technical stories that aren't actually delivering something to the customer in the domain that you're working in. Low emphasis on delivery capability, so the final deliverable gets too much focus. And this is, I probably should word this differently. What I'm trying to talk about is, we're more concerned about delivering a big hunk of things at the end when it will all be done, instead of, what have we delivered this week? What did we deliver the next week? What have we delivered? What have we delivered today? Instead, we're focused on, well, 6 months down the road, we'll deliver all of this stuff. And if we're not focused on the delivery capability of being able to get pieces all the way through and deliver small bits of things all the way through, focusing on the final deliverable, if it obscures what we're doing today, then it can be very dangerous. Creation of waste. Developers don't produce usable code. So there are lots of things that can sound really, really good on a project that don't result in code for the user. And some of those things can be very, very important, but it needs to be driven by what we're delivering to the user, because otherwise there's no guardrails around making sure that we're doing exactly what's needed.
He's not admitting that you said. He's still saying he needs continued engagement.
I'm sorry, what?
Someone just needs to mute themselves.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Here, I will mute everybody just so no one says anything embarrassing on mic. There we go. Okay. Okay, cool. Where were we? Okay. Developers don't create usable code. So focusing on things that isn't constrained or isn't tied directly to something that we're giving to the user. Customer collaboration is discouraged. So an organization that builds barriers from working directly with the customer and being able to get that feedback. And finally, conflicting priorities. So goals that are orthogonal to the project success. So things that might be good, might be very important to a particular individual, but if they supersede the goal of actually delivering the project, they can cause that project to fail. So let's start with large teams. So some questions to ask is, what's the cost of a misstep with 5 developers? If I try to do something with 5 developers and I spend 2 months and I'm like, hey, you know what? We tried doing this. We tried using this technology. We tried using this programming language. We tried using this cloud service, whatever it does, or we tried this management structure, whatever it is. We tried this. It turns out after 2 months, this was a bad idea. We need to redirect and do something else. What's the cost of that with 5 developers versus the cost with 50 developers. And this is one of the big risks with large teams, is we end up betting the farm on things before we've actually proven that it works. If you do actually need 50 developers, get what you're trying to do working with 5 developers first and prove that it actually works and that you're on track to deliver at some point in the future, that it's even possible to do what you're trying to do before you scale it up. Because once you have 50 developers involved, it's a lot more likely for any missteps to cause the project to be killed, which is what we want to try to avoid. Large teams. Do all the team members add value? So another issue with large teams is if you're focused on having more people, it's very easy to add people that aren't necessarily going to bring much value to the team. And one of the reasons this is one thing that we often don't think about is the fact that you can add people to a team that actually contribute negative value, that are doing things that are actually slowing the team down. And at first it kind of sounds like, oh, well, all of my developers are at this level, so they won't do that. It's not always just a matter of skill, though. It can be a matter of focus. I've been on teams where there were very, very skilled developers that were doing things that sounded really good, but since they weren't 100% aligned with delivering the software to the customer, it actually slowed the rest of the team down because they had different priorities they were trying to do. So it's not just a matter of skill. Having skill is important, right? If you add somebody to a team that's really unskilled and you can't bring them up to the level of skill, it will slow the team down and can result in failure of the project. I think in most cases, it's less risky to have a moderately skilled developer that doesn't know stuff that's trying to learn. That's something that a small team can work with. A skilled developer that's headed in a different direction is a lot bigger risk. And we'll talk about more of that in just a little bit. So how do we prove we have something that's actually worth scaling? We can do that with a small team a lot better than with a large team. So if we try to scale things and then discover we scaled something that doesn't actually help us, we might end up with a team that is about equivalent to these cars right here, okay? So this one car has completely scaled up the spoiler on the back of it. That probably is not providing much value to the car, but they scaled it really, really big before they probably proved out even if they needed a spoiler, right? And this other one has scaled up. I think they scaled up. They may have just dropped that engine on it. But imagine that they're actually fitting that engine in the car. They've scaled it up so big that it's the wrong thing to scale, right? For that car, that engine is probably not the thing that needs to be scaled in order to be productive. Okay, number 2, avoiding domain work. So what have you seen teams do to avoid domain work? So what have you most seen teams do to avoid domain work? Is it research? And keep in mind, these can be good things, but if they start coming at the expense of actually delivering incremental progress to the user, they're probably going to hurt your project. And I threw defragment hard drives on here. I once worked at a place that had a TV show they produced. And I remember talking to the manager one time, and he's like, yeah, no one can do anything today because they're all defragmenting. All the video editors were defragmenting their hard drive. And I wanted to say, they could set that to run overnight. They're pulling the wool over your eyes, and I didn't, because I didn't want to start a problem with people. But that's what the video editor's excuse was for a day of not doing any work, is they were sitting there waiting for their hard drives to defragment instead of just setting it to do it overnight and it not being an issue that's keeping them from working. Okay, so it looks like research is a really big one that people experience, where we're trying to do research, and maybe we're trying to do so much research that we put off actually working on the problem. A far better approach is to actually say, okay, is there any piece of this problem that we know? Let's try to deliver that. And possibly in the process of delivering that piece, we'll actually figure out what the next piece is we need. And we may learn just enough about it to take that next step. Which isn't to say you never need to do research, but that's an approach that can help. Avoiding domain work. So one thing, setting up your pipeline sounds like a good idea, right? This is a very important thing to do. But what if it turns out not to be fit for purpose? What if you end up building a pipeline that doesn't actually support the way that you're doing your development work? Or what if you end up building a pipeline that forces the development work to be done in a way that is very, very inefficient for what you're doing? And that's where most of this type of work needs to happen along with the domain work of saying, hey, we need to deliver. Here's the first thing we're going to deliver. We're going to create a web page that's got the title at the top of it. What will it take for us to deliver this? Well, we'll need this in the pipeline. Then build that part of the pipeline and let them evolve together so you can make sure they work well together. Avoiding open-ended research is another thing to watch out for. It's very easy to get, like, so I have a dictionary over here. It's the Oxford Illustrated Dictionary. It is the worst dictionary to look anything up in because you get distracted by all the pictures and you forget what word you're looking for. Open-ended research that's not constrained by what you're actually trying to deliver, of we're trying to do this particular thing that we're going to do in 2 or 3 days and we just need to do enough research to deliver that, is like looking through that dictionary. Wikipedia is an example, right? You go to Wikipedia looking for one thing, 4 hours later, you've read all kinds of things and you can't remember why you started there in the first place. Proof of concept. This is another way that something that can be good, but often can be done in a way that avoids doing domain work. So have you ever heard somebody say, let's build a bookstore application to learn how to build the real application? Well, that's great if you're actually building a bookstore, maybe you can use that. But if you're not actually building a bookstore, that's not what the customer wants. There may not be a lot of overlap between what you're doing in the bookstore and what the customer wants. And even if there is overlap, you're probably better off building a thin version of what the customer is asking for that you can evolve into the complete application, rather than building something that's, way off here on the side. And this is very enticing. And as a developer, I really like this. Let's build something and it doesn't matter. We can just build it. But I've been on teams that have tried doing this and spent huge amounts of time building all these kind of proof of concepts things. And then when they tried to actually take what they learned and apply it to the domain, there were specific things in the domain that were unique enough. You're not seeing anything? There were specific things in the domain that were unique enough that it didn't actually help them as much as they thought it would. Okay, Robert said he's having problems with the presentation. So I just changed and there should be crazy signs on there. Is that working okay for everybody else? Okay, cool. Okay, misleading definition of progress. This is the one that everybody voted saying was the one they were most, the biggest thing. So things related to misleading definition of progress: saying work is done before it's actually been deployed. Saying work is done before it's been tested. If you start calling things progress before it's actually made to the point that it's been deployed and before it's been tested, you'll make yourself think you're a lot further on, and you're creating hidden work. These types of things can make a big difference, or can wreck a project while feeling like you're doing a great job with it. Calling something progress that doesn't deliver anything for the user. This is where technical stories can be really, really dangerous, because it looks like you're doing work. You're doing lots of actual things. There's lots of activity happening, and people may be working really, really hard. But if it's not tied to things that deliver things for the users, you're creating a lot of risk. So those things which may be really, really good, you want to split those down to where they're actually being used to deliver a small piece of something to the user that you can demonstrate to them. And that helps make sure that your definition of progress isn't getting kind of off the rails or headed in a direction that's not going to be, that's misleading you. Low emphasis on delivery cycle time. So working on things to get ready to do deployment. This can be research and things like that, but I put this as a separate category, because I think it's a big deal for us to think about is, are we actually saying how long does it take me to get something from the user asked for it, business owner asked for it, and I delivered it through to production or the production-like environment? And if if the team isn't worried about how long that cycle time is, it's going to be very easy to do a lot of things that aren't guided by the value that you're providing to the customer. Doing research can be one of those things, or spikes that don't result in usable code. If I'm doing, oftentimes spikes are used to say, we're going to go work on this and it might not turn out and we may have to throw everything away. That is not a bad thing to try to do. But your spikes are going to be much better and much more focused if it's a spike of saying, hey, we need to, we need to come up with a way to talk to external entities, something like that. So we're going to try this technology. We're going to create a story around it. We'll try this technology, and we're hoping that it works out and it's awesome. And then we say, this is how we want to do it going forward. But there's a chance that we're going to try to deliver this and decide this isn't a good idea. We need to stop trying to deliver this and start over with a different technology. But the difference between what I just described and how spikes are often done is, in the case I'm describing, you're driven by, can I deliver this one thing right here? versus can I find out all the things I might want to know about the technology behind this? And so spikes that don't result in usable code can be a dangerous thing because they're not focused on the cycle time of how do I deliver something and how do I deliver something in a short frame of time. If you're focused on trying to deliver something quickly to the user and you try some technology and it turns out it doesn't work, that's okay. It's probably a lot lower risk than if you go off and you say, I'm going to research stuff with the idea that there's no chance it's going to deliver anything to the user and you'll just use that information on another story. This kind of comes back to the idea of trying to work in the domain, trying to do your work in the domain. So you're actually proving out that you can solve problems in the domain, not just solve an abstract technical problem. Here's a quote. Something like this I've heard from some unsuccessful projects. We don't want to worry about cycle time for the first year while we set everything up. And this sounded really good because it's like we're going to get everything in place so we can develop really, really fast at some point in the future. The problem is, if it's not constrained by the domain that you're working in, it's very hard to know if you're doing the right thing. And there's a really big chance that a lot of things you try to set up ahead of time won't be the right thing, and you won't know it till you've built a lot of other stuff on top of it. Creating waste. So developers aren't producing code that does work for the user. They're producing other code. Maybe the proof of concepts would be examples of that, or just doing things that seem like really good ideas but aren't directly tied to delivering something to the users. Now, you'll probably hear a question might come up and say, well, what about enablement teams, right? The teams that are going to deliver stuff that the developer is going to use to actually deliver the application. There can be a place for those, and I'm not saying there's no way that can ever be helpful, but enablement efforts have to be measured based on their ability to deliver code to the user. The longer you go doing development or enablement work without it actually delivering, without that work being used to actually deliver something to the user, the more risk you're creating that you're headed in the wrong direction without knowing it. Too often enablement creates software and processes that no one asked for and that isn't actually fit for purpose. So this is a very, very big risk. And it's not to say that there's no way that doing some enablement work isn't valuable, but you want to make sure you've got that feedback loop telling you if what you're doing is actually helpful. Because it's really easy to create, like, you create a bunch of enablement work based on a pet store application or a bookstore application that's not in your problem domain. Then you start working in the problem domain and discover, hey, we built a bunch of great enablement work if we were actually delivering a pet store or a bookstore. But we're not. We're delivering something else that has specific requirements that we didn't discover until we actually tried to use it. But now we've got this huge foundation that's really not built to support what we're trying to deliver. Creating waste. The delivery of functionality that the user can experience is the compass that shows if you are going in the right direction. So this is what we want to guide us, is things that we can give to the customer. If that is being delivered, then there's probably a good chance that you're minimizing your waste, right? Because you're creating stuff and using it to deliver stuff to the customer. The longer you wait before you have that compass check of saying, does this actually help us deliver stuff to the customer, the more risk you're incurring. Number 6, customer collaboration is discouraged. So here is a question for you. How would you rate the collaboration between your developers and your customer? And I probably should have made this more broad than just your developers, but your team. How would you rate that collaboration? Is it really, really good? Fast feedback, a good working relationship? Would these people hang out after work because they like working with each other? Where does that, and I like this where we've got a lot of people over, or several people over here. That's great. Some people kind of more in the middle. No one's in the frowny face over at the side, which either means you guys are all great or no one's willing to admit it. Either way, it looks better. So this is something to think about with, and I would kind of encourage you, this would probably be something worth doing, taking a poll like this with your team and asking your team what they think. Not every team has interface with the customer though. So that's a good, there is someone that is asking for the software that you produce. And I would suggest that if you do not have access to the people that could be delighted with the software that you produce, then you might want to look at rethinking the way that things are structured. Because if you're insulated from them, you're not going to be able to prioritize things effectively without having back and forth with the people that you're trying to delight. But that is a good point, right? So is it the end user? Maybe your customer is actually some intermediary between that, or is another team or something. But there's somebody, hopefully we're producing software that makes the world better for someone, and who is that person? So practices of failure, customer collaboration is discouraged. Sometimes there's the worry that the developers can't be interrupted to talk to the customer. If the customer actually knows what they need, and maybe what they need is changing, keeping them from talking to the developer kind of guarantees that you're going to be in a case that the developer is going to work on stuff that's not necessarily what's the most important thing to the customer next. There's also, I've seen places where there's concern that strong relationships between devs and users will undermine management. In some organizations, people actually get a lot of power from controlling information, and honing the message and stuff. And it's not that there's never a reason where you need to be careful how things are communicated, but you can get in situations where that is actually keeping things from being developed efficiently. I know I heard about a situation where this team had put a Kanban board up that showed where the state of everything was up on the wall. So it was crystal clear exactly where things were, what was blocked, what was holding it up, what was getting finished, and there was just a huge amount of transparency. They had it for about a week, and the CTO walked in and tore the whole thing off the wall. And the reason is because his power and the way that he was important in the organization was being able to kind of control information about who it got sent to here and who it got sent to here, and telling this person, asking for this and giving part of the information over here. And once it was made transparent, it kind of freaked him out because he no longer could do that and didn't feel like he had control of things anymore. Now, obviously that's a dysfunction, and that's kind of an extreme example of it. But that type of thing does exist. And there's sometimes that type of setup or type of political structure is actually discouraging customer collaboration. I've heard, I've seen projects that actually said things along the line, we don't want the developers getting too chummy with the business users, right? They wanted some type of barrier there because there was concern that if they developed too much of a friendly working relationship with the business user, that would somehow impact the organization negatively. Maybe things would be more transparent than people want. But this is unfortunate, but this is the way that some organizations are structured. This is not a good, if you're hearing quotes like this isn't a good thing set up for efficiently delivering for the customer or the business user. Conflicting priorities. I put a night as conflict because I've been reading through a book about kind of the middle age, during like Black Death period, and all the knights, and how a lot of times their priorities, different classes, the war between England and France in the mid 1300s, there were lots of different competing priorities, and sometimes what was a priority for the king was not a priority for the knights, and lots of conflict came out of that. But here's another example of conflicting priority. Right? So teacher is saying, if you don't turn in at least one homework assignment, you'll fail this class. And the student says, yeah, but if I can fail this class, the grades on my report card will be in alphabetical order. Okay, these are completely conflicting priorities, right? Very different idea of what success looks like here. Conflicting priorities. Exciting projects can attract people with goals that aren't aligned with the project's success. So this happens a lot, particularly in greenfield projects. You'll have people coming out of the woodwork to try to do things that they've wanted to do other places, but they weren't able to do. Not all of those things they want to do are aligned with the project's success. So, for example, I've been on projects where they were trying to create a framework, and one of the architects they had on it was very focused on trying to create this big framework that would do all these things. But it became so important that he wasn't willing to step back when it wasn't the best fit for the project, or when there were better ways to do things. It can be trying to create a framework. Let's see, resume-driven development. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I've was working on a project and had one of the developers was quoting saying, when I learn how to use X, this particular piece of technology, I'll be able to make big bucks as a consultant. Now, it's not bad that they were wanting to use X, and this may very well have been true, but their approach to thing was to try to use X every place they possibly could, whether it was a good fit for that particular project or not. And in this case, lots of effort got spent on trying to use X to the detriment of the project, and it was eventually canceled. Increased headcounts. I've also seen places where the goal really was by management to have large teams under them, because that's how you got status and promotion, was having large teams. that was a conflicting priority. And I'm thinking about one thing where there were two pieces of the organization kind of bidding on this particular project. One part of the organization was trying to do it with 50 developers, and it was going to take 5 years. The other part of the organization did it with about 5 developers, 5 to 8 developers, and did it in 4 years. The thing that was driving the count of 50, and I doubt if they would have even delivered on in the 5-year period based on other projects, but the thing that was really driving that was the management got a lot of clout and promotions based on how big the teams were under them. So that was driving the headcount more so than starting with saying, what's the most efficient way to deliver this particular project? So how well aligned are the individual's goals with the team's success on your current project? Oh, I guess this already popped this up. Okay, cool. So it looks like most of us are 50 to 80% aligned. Okay, 20 to 40% over there. And there's not a right or wrong answer. I think it's probably unlikely that you will ever have 100% alignment, right? There's the goal of the organization. People also like things like, would they just come to work if there wasn't a paycheck? Probably not. So, their goals are aligned on getting their paycheck and stuff. And that's not bad. That's good. But the lower you go on the amount of alignment, the more risk that you're actually incurring. Okay, so it looks like most of us are in the 50 to 80% alignment, which isn't incredibly bad. But I think the important part of this is to think about this, right? Where does your team actually fall? And is there anything you can do to get better alignment? And is there anything you can do to keep from getting worse alignment? Okay, so that covers the first half, the longer half, of problems with things that can lead, practices of failure, things that can lead to failure on team. So brief intermission and a word from Xeric Corporation, which is my company, actually the company my wife owns that I'm an employee in. I just wanted to let you know to reach out if your team needs help with any of these things. These are the type of things that my company does, supports other companies in. Test-driven development, if teams are looking to set up TDD, wanting to learn TDD, workshops on TDD, that's something that we can do. Like I said, I'm really excited about this talk coming up in 2 weeks. Behavior-driven development, trying to make sure we can specify the behavior of the application as a executable specification. Decreasing cycle time, looking for ways to do that. Continuous integration, continuous deployment. Agile coaching or training. A lot of the work I do is as an embedded Agile coach, so coming in and coaching Agile while working with developers, day in, day out, writing code with them. And then we also do some software engineering and development, particularly in areas, one of the more interesting areas are things that, like side projects that are very, very important, but there's either not the expertise to do in-house, or there's concern that it might not even be possible. That's the type of thing that we've enjoyed working with. Okay, I'm getting screen is frozen. I guess WebEx is having a bad day today. Okay. Does everybody see habits that enable success? Got it? Okay. Okay, I mean, you know what? I think there was a storm and I unplugged my wired connection, and I probably should have plugged it back in. I'm not sure what will happen if I plug it in right now while we're in the middle of it. So we'll go for it. What habit do you think is most aligned with successful software teams? So go ahead and type those in. I'm going to actually plug this in. Oh, it is plugged in. Okay, so we should be good. Good thing we didn't get struck by lightning. What habit do you think is most aligned with successful software teams? So things that the team does as a habit. Trust, that's good. My company is Xeric.net. Somebody was asking how to find it, and there's not a huge presence online. My biggest presence is probably doing these lunch and learns online. You can also look for Mark Shed, and you'll find a lot of my stuff. The company name isn't the main thing I market under. It's usually under my name, but that's just the corporate structure. Probably shouldn't even put that on the slide, but it's there. Okay, autonomy, collaboration, open communication, collaboration, motivated and team spirit, frequent collaboration. These are all good, very good Okay, I think I'm back. I've got a monitor computer that's hooked in. I think say, okay, cool. I'm not sure what's unhappy today. I wonder if we did get some type of lightning strike. I'll have to relook at this. So thanks for bearing with me. Okay, moving on. 5 habits that enable success. So here's the 5 habits that come to my mind, the things that stick with me on teams that I've seen be successful. They're user-driven, so that's driving what they're doing. System focus, teamwork, risk mitigation, and prioritization. So the user-driven meaning they're focused on code that the user can experience. System focus, they're looking for long-term rapid iteration. And that means they're not unwilling to make investments in things that will let them rapidly deliver, but they're still being user-driven. So they're doing all those investments and things that let them rapidly deliver along with delivering stuff for the user. But there's still that system focus of how do we make our process support delivering stuff, not just how do we get something as fast to the user as possible with no thought of the system that we're building. And by system, I don't just mean the application. I mean everything around the application that lets you deliver changes to that application. Teamwork, intentional extreme, collaborative cross-functionality. Risk mitigation, recognizing that not everything planned will be finished. And this is a big thing of approaching things from a standpoint that we want to be in the best position. Every day we want to be closer to the best possible position to handle unknowns. And so we don't want to do, there's 100 things we may want to do, but how do we make sure that we're doing these things in a way that lower our risk? Prioritization, clarity on what to leave undone, which is very closely related, but we'll talk about how it's a little bit different. User-driven. So we focus on code that the users can experience. User stories tell how it benefits the user. Demos can be driven by a user. So this means if we're developing software in a way that the user can actually demonstrate it, we're going to be very user-driven in how we actually create our stories and how we deliver those slices through. If we have a lot of demos where it's the developer going in and showing something at a command line and saying, hey, we did all this research and look, we're able to do this, that's not user-driven. Now, that isn't to say you never get to a situation where it's like, hey, we're going to have a user go through and do this in the demo. They're going to do this, this, and this. And that's going to create an order and stick it in the database. But we don't have a UI for that yet. So then we'll have a developer show you that it's in the database. So that's great because you're still doing something that touches the user. But if the developer has to show every single piece of it, you're probably not doing your stories in a real user-driven way. Doesn't mean you'll never do anything like that. But if most of your stories, I've been on teams where some groups, everything they were demonstrating was not something that the user understood. It's not something the user could use. And it wasn't even code that would ever be touched by a user in any way. That's what you want to avoid. The more user-driven you can be, the more likely you will be, or the more user-driven you can be in the way that you do your work, the more likely you will be to succeed. System focus. So long-term rapid iteration. The deliverable is less important than the process. And when I wrote this, I was like, I'm not going to put that because that will mislead people. And then I thought, well, maybe it'll make us all really think really deeply about it. And what I want us to think about is there may be, like I said, 1,000 things that we want to do. And if we get so focused on delivering those 1,000 things that we don't think about the system that's going to iteratively deliver those things as individual units of value, then we're not system focused. We're just kind of like magic day, everything works in the future. System focus sets you up to where you're thinking about how you're going to deliver each piece of it, which puts you in a position that you've got to handle the fact that things may change. What's important to the customer today may not be important tomorrow. And do we have a system that actually handles taking whatever the next most important thing is, quickly delivering it to the customer, and then working on the next thing? That's a focus on the system. Just trying to figure out how do we code rapidly till we get, or code as fast as we can to get 1,000 things out the door isn't the system focus of how do we iterate. We need to think about how we're building a factory for creating the software and that being our focus. Now, building the factory by actually building the software and then enhancing the factory to make that more efficient, not just we're going to spend 5 years building a factory and hopefully by then we'll be able to deliver the software really, really fast because we built this factory. Still got to be driven by the user's needs. Teamwork.
Hey, Mark, just
Yes.
one question. Where will the IT and tech debt fall under? Is it user-driven, system-focused, or how
Okay, so I think your question is, you've got, how do you deal with tech debt if you're trying to drive everything in a user-driven way? So the first thing, and keep in mind, I'm not saying that there's never a point where you would ever do a story that isn't something you can show the user. But most teams struggle with doing most of their work in ways that's not driven by the user. And that's what you want. If you do something that's like, hey, we need to redo this and the user isn't going to see it, there's no way for the user to experience this, that should be something that everybody stops and says, do we really want to do this? Instead of just the normal thing that you're doing. But as far as tech debt and things like that, the first thing to do is try to, as much as possible, get your definition of done to be done in a way that minimizes the tech debt that you have. Second, make sure your software process in your factory for delivering things is done in a way that if you encounter some tech debt as you're delivering a story, it's not a big deal to just fix it as you go. So kind of like the difference of, I'm going to not clean my house for a year and then come in and try to clean stuff, versus no, I'm going to clean stuff as I go. So most of those, a large percentage of stuff that usually gets done as tech debt could be done just as part of the stories that are being delivered. It's a very good question, and it's could be an entire another talk. But your goal is to minimize the tech debt, and you may have to do extraordinary things to get to the point that you can do that. But your goal should be not to have a bunch of things that aren't actually delivering value to the customer. If you need to do that, it's probably an indication that something has gone wrong in the past. Let me give examples. So this team was starting and they were trying to, first thing they needed to do was a very simple thing that basically said, we've got a form, it was a greenfield development. We've got a form, the user's going to fill it out, and then it's going to show up on this other page here, the things. And that was the first step in a very complicated process. So they asked themselves, what's the fastest way to do this? And they said, well, we can do this really, really quickly. If we do it on the back end, we're just going to use JavaScript on the back end to handle it and throw it in a database. We won't use the database we're planning on using. We'll just use a NoSQL database. We can get this done really, really quickly like this. So they delivered that story to the user. And then the user said, yes, that looks great. Okay, here's what we want to do next. Well, the next story they did, they're like, okay, that database and the way we use JavaScript on the back end really isn't the direction we want to go. We learned a lot from it. We got it to work. But now we're going to rewrite the back end as part of this next story to use these other features because we'll need that for this next story. Since this team had invested in test-driven development and behavior-driven development, they could swap out the back end and still prove that the front end did exactly what the user was expecting. So it was a pretty trivial thing just to spend an hour or two to swap out the back end with, in this case, they were swapping out with Java, and say, okay, that's working now. Now we're going to add these fields to it. Okay, now we're done and we deliver this. Had they not made that investment in BDD and TDD, it would have been a lot more difficult for them to make that change just as part of the next story. And they would have been likely to want to have had, oh, here's a tech debt. We need to switch from JavaScript to Java. Ideally, we want, when we're incrementally changing things, we want those types of things just to fit within a story because we've made the investment in proving that the application does what it's supposed to do. And it's a different approach than I think a lot of times teams are used to, but that's the way that I've seen it. And you end up with a really, really rapid iteration like that. So like I said, huge topic, but thank you for asking that. And reach out if you want to talk about more, because that's a very, very good question.
Thanks, Mark.
Teamwork needs to be intentional. It needs to be cross-functional, and it needs to be collaborative. So when teams are working in a way that is intentional, cross-functional, and collaborative, what I see them doing is things like saying, okay, we're pair programming. I've been on teams where they're like, no one touch the code unless you're with someone else because we want to make sure we share the knowledge. I've seen stories picked up where somebody says, I want to do that story because that works with this particular technology that we're using and I haven't touched it yet. And they say, I know the least about it, so I want to work on this. And then somebody says, well, I probably know the most about it, so I'll pair with you and we'll both work on this together. You work like that for a few months, and it doesn't take long until you've got a very cross-functional team and really good collaboration, and they're being very, very intentional about how they collaborate and work together. Risk mitigation. So things to do to lower risk mitigation is trying to bring the go live date forward. We may not need to go live for 12 months. Let's say we don't need to go live for 12 months. But risk mitigation says we should go ahead and work in a way that lets us have the option of going live in 6 months or 3 months or whatever it is. Are we getting to a point that the system is usable and could be deployed in a shorter time frame? And once we have that, we then have options. We can handle the risk if for some reason it takes a little bit longer. We can also handle the risk if for some reason the market changes and the customer needs something they didn't needs it sooner, or needs to head a different direction. But bringing the go live date forward and trying to think about how can we get to the point that it would be possible to deploy this to the customer, to give them the option of deploying it, even if they choose to wait till they get all the things they ask for, that's great. We're now giving them the option to do that instead of requiring them to do that. And bringing risk forward. Thinking of an example of a team I was working with, and they were needing to use a different type of authentication that no one in the organization had integrated with before. It was something new that was being stood up. So they did that very, very early on in their process to prove that they could do it, because it was something that was seen as a risk. And if for some reason it didn't work and they couldn't do it, they'd need to head in a very different direction. But they were able to bring that risk forward, and it worked out very well for, in this case, they were able to prove that they could do it. But had they waited till the end, or waited till further on, they could have built a lot of stuff, and then in ways that they could have taken on a lot of risks that they didn't need to if they had have waited. I've been in other places where they're like, hey, we're using this new technology. We don't know if it can actually perform to the level we need. So they started off, when the first things they did is like, what's the simplest path through this? Let's load test. Let's build just that part, show it to the user, and then let's load test it. And every night we'll actually run a load test on whatever we've committed, so we can prove if we ever get to the point, if we ever hit something that starts making us not meet our performance benchmarks, we'll know about that. And but they brought that risk forward to where they were testing it as they built the application, rather than waiting to the end and saying, okay, now we build everything. Oh, hey, turns out it's 100 times slower than it needs to be. Prioritization. The value of prioritization. So when you've got a team that's very focused and everyone knows exactly what they need to do next, it's very, very valuable. Here's a cartoon. I encourage you to check out the other at markettunist.com. He's got some great ones there. I think it's Tom Fishburne. We need to stay focused on our marketing priorities and not get distracted by every shiny new, oh, look, there's a squirrel. So for development teams, though, the shiny new thing that could be distracting could be a new technology, a new approach of doing things. It could be different team structures, trying to structure your teams in a different way, and that becomes the distraction from the actual priority you're trying to deliver. When you can have agreement on what can be deferred, it's very, very powerful. It can be a hard thing to do, but when you see teams really, if you haven't ever seen a small team working this way, where they get together, here's this story. Oh, yes, we can do that. And then somebody says, is there any way we can split this into something smaller? And somebody, a developer says, hey, well, I think this part is kind of distinct from this part. Could we split it that way? And the business owner goes, oh, I didn't know we could split that way. Yeah, let's break those into different stories. This part right here is really important. Let's do that. Let's put this other stuff on the backlog, because we may never do that. If we can actually split those things out separately, this is a lot lower priority than everything else on the backlog. Those type of conversations make a huge difference in your ability to deliver software quickly and efficiently. But you've got to have a culture and an understanding of prioritization to agree on what can be deferred, which usually happens through collaboration. The opposite extreme of that is where you have a conversation like, hey, can we split this up? Or what's most important? And everybody thinks that their thing is the most important because they don't trust that the development team will ever get around to it if it doesn't happen now. Those type of conversations are very, very painful. They don't feel nearly as good as the one where you're splitting things and being able to reprioritize. So a quote from a really good business owner: if part of this story is hard, let's split out the hard part into another story so they can then prioritize both of these stories independently and deliver the one that provides the most value up front. Clarity on what the next most important thing is. It's amazing how often teams don't actually know what the next most important thing is. Or don't agree, or you've got somebody trying to work on non-domain work as the next most important thing, and other people trying to deliver domain work as the next most important thing, and there's no clear strategy for how are we going to deliver this to the customer. Good question to ask is there any possible future where we could go live without this particular story? So, okay, we've got a few minutes left here. I'm going to skip the quiz at the end, and what I want to leave you with are some questions you can ask your team. So here's some questions to ask your team that can help align your team with these habits of success we've talked about. So one of the questions is, how would a user demonstrate this story to a stakeholder? And if no one can answer how they would deliver this story to the stakeholder, then it may be an indication you need to try to slice it in a different way. There may be a different approach that takes you, or maybe you should work on something else first. Maybe you need to get a slice that gets through and touches something that the user could demonstrate. It doesn't mean that there's never a case that you would have a story that they couldn't demonstrate. But if you're consistently working on things that you can't demonstrate, asking this question should help you focus more on how you're going to be more user-driven. Some other questions to ask your team. How much overhead is there to take a simple story all the way through to production or your production-like environment? And what can we do to lower that as part of our current story? In other words, instead of saying we're going to build all this stuff up front, independent of the application to deploy it, and then we're going to start working on our application, how can we iterate not only on our application, but our delivery capability as well? And this is part of the system focus, because we're not just thinking about how do we finish this story, but how do we actually deliver it, and how do we make that process more efficient? How do we make a system that lets us iteratively deliver? Another question. If Alice knows something that will solve a problem Bob is facing, how long does it take for that collaboration to occur? This is part of the teamwork, right? If this takes a day or you have to wait till the stand-up, there are ways to have better collaboration and better teamwork. Another question, are there risky parts of this that we should try to do earlier in the process? This is the risk mitigation, right? Asking these questions to your team can help bring up the things that you may want to bring forward in order to mitigate risk. Is there any possible future where we would be willing to go without this particular story? And this comes down to prioritization. And oftentimes you've got to get really, really creative and really dig deep to decide if there is any possible future. But I've seen cases where we were trying to build something and it needed to have a UI to deal with adding holidays into the system. When we asked this question and really pushed, the business owner said, you know what, if there's a way for us to load the holidays in from a CSV file into the database, we really don't need this for another year. And so that became, there was a possible future where we could go live without that particular story. And we took that and provided that future. It gave us the ability to deliver the software faster. Okay, I am going to jump to, let's see, I've got one more thing I'd like to get your feedback on. Do it here. There we go, okay. So I would love to get your feedback on this talk. Let me know what you thought. There's just a few questions there. Shouldn't take very long to fill out. Really, really appreciate the feedback. And I will stick around for a few minutes. If anyone has any thoughts, concerns, disagreements, or questions about any of this, I would love to talk with you. And yes, so what did everybody think? But please do fill that out. It makes a big difference to me when I can tell what resonated with people and maybe what didn't.